Professor Wolff, thank you for being here. The main question is, we have a Biden now. He seems to be doing things. Has he slowed down the edging closer to the collapse of capitalism, or is that just still lingering over us like the sword of Damocles?
I think, unfortunately, it's the latter. It is hanging over us, and he is being what he has always been, a centrist, democratic leader who comes from the state of Delaware, which is the home of more corporations than any other state in the United States. And as Donald Harris, the father of Kamala Harris, said about her, he said she's been captured by her donors. I think that's a reasonable thing to say about Mr. Biden as well.
And Vice President Harris's father is like a lefty, right?
Yep, he's an economist, a bit like me. I've worked with him in my life more than once, and very, very good economist. Was a professor of economics at Stanford University in California. That's indeed why Kamala comes from California, because her father and mother met and got married and so forth over there. Everything is going very slowly. And, under other circumstances, if we were back, I don't know, in the 60s or 70s, going slow could have been defended. But at the critical moment we are now, it cannot be defended. And the worst thing about it is not just what isn't being done, although I'd be glad to talk about it. It's that the Democratic Party, by not making a break, by doing things that are adequate to the level of problem we have, the Democratic Party is risking that its next 4 years will pave the way for another Trump.
Oh, God, you're terrifying me.
Well, I think I have to do that, because I really think that if you keep doing this, the minimum wage is an example, the failure to come up with a jobs program of anything like the size we need, these are terrible mistakes. The Democratic Party, if it were to break from that, really do something, would win millions of people's loyalty, the way when Roosevelt did it in the 30s that happened. And they don't seem to understand that. And it's like watching a slow motion crash.
So President Biden has been in office for a week. We haven't heard much about a jobs program. Is it possible that he might still do something as he sees us inch closer and closer to the edge here?
Well, I suppose it's possible. I wish I could tell you that I see the signs. Let me give you an idea of what the mismatch here is. We currently have, and depends a little bit on which statistics you use, but a generally accepted number, somewhere in excess of 20 million people currently collecting unemployment compensation, either from a state government or the federal government or a combination of both. His program for mass testing is talking about 100,000 people. His program for a Green New Deal doesn't even have government jobs. He's talking about stimulating the private sector, which leaves it up to the private sector to determine how many jobs they will, in fact, create. This is way too little to deal with a problem of 20-odd million Americans unemployed. In the 1930s, an answer was found that we could use now. Why isn't Mr. Biden and Ms. Harris doing what Roosevelt did in the 30s? Namely, the government comes in and puts people to work, gives them a job, gives them an income that allows them to pay their rent or meet their mortgage, and gets them to do the things we know we need as a society. Massive testing, massive care for our COVID cases, massive New Deal, green or otherwise, a program of daycare that's good, high quality, to liberate young families the adults so they can work, a program for our growing old age population that is otherwise going to be in a lot of trouble in the years ahead. I mean, we know what we need. We have people who ask for a job, and we ought to put these together, and a Democrat is who you would expect to do it, and yet silence. There's no program coming from Mr. Biden. There's no debate that I'm aware of in Congress about the size and scope of a federal jobs program. And for me, that is a very bad sign of what's coming, or more honestly, what isn't coming.
Given the realities of our political system, what would be the best possible things we could press for? You mentioned a jobs program. We're going to talk a little bit later about increase in minimum wage. What else?
Well, there's a number of things. The jobs is the most urgent kind of thing. A program for higher minimum wage is unspeakably long overdue. I'll be glad to talk to you about that. But there are a number of other things. Our economy right now is fundamentally hobbled by levels of unsustainable debt. The government is in debt beyond anything we have ever seen. Corporations and businesses are in debt beyond anything we have ever seen. And families are heavily in debt. It's not the worst we've seen. They've been kind of holding back because they were so burnt in 2008 and 9. But something has to be done because people and businesses cannot function.
Professor Wolff,
one out of 5 businesses today are what we call zombie corporations. A zombie corporation is a business that isn't making enough profit simply to cover their interest costs. So they're losing propositions. Wow. You know, these are, and I could go on, you know, we have millions of people who haven't paid their rent. We have hundreds of thousands of commercial stores that haven't paid their rent. The landlords haven't got the money, so they're not paying off the banks that they borrowed from. I mean, these situations are volcanoes about to blow, and I don't see anything like the massive intervention by the government, which is the only way to make this work out.
Professor Wolff, sometimes a massive intervention by the government has to do with austerity politics. My fear is that we will inch toward more austerity. I'm not necessarily seeing that with Biden and what he has announced recently today, but it certainly seems like when we talk about the deficit, when we talk about debt, usually what the government does is say, okay, we have to cut Medicaid. You know, we've got to cut Social Security. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that's perfectly in the cards. You're going to get that. If the Democrats fail to fix the economy by an intervention that helps people on a massive basis, you're going to get the Republicans and the conservatives in the Democratic Party to go the other route and say, okay, that didn't work. What we need is austerity. We need to cut back and all the rest of it, liberate the private economy. I am crystal clear in my mind that that will not work either. But yes, that's the kind of oscillation we have. You know, after the crash of 2008, the Europeans did undertake austerity. That's why Greece was crushed. That's why the Italian and French and other economies really took a hit. And they've been suffering the last 10 years because of it. They're not going to go back to austerity because the mass of their people are so disgusted by it that if anything, they're going in the other direction. I think the United States will follow suit. But my fear is that if the Biden government continues to do too little and too late, it will create the kind of anger and bitterness that we saw on January 6th in DC, and that will push in the direction of, for example, letting those millions of people facing eviction literally be thrown out on the street with an impact on our COVID problem and our social problems that I can't even imagine in terms of how serious they will be.
Professor Wolff, I'm glad to have you here on the program. Professor Wolff is the host of Economic Update. You can find it on radio stations across the country and also on YouTube. I encourage everyone to go and subscribe. The YouTube channel is called Democracy at Work. Professor Wolff, you mentioned skyrocketing deficits. We recently had Stephanie Kelton on, who is an economist, speaking about modern monetary policy and the fact that the idea of the deficit is something that gets mislabeled and is a tool of the right to basically say we need austerity because we have to pay off this deficit. Can you, your idea of the deficit, how does it square with this new idea of modern monetary policy?
Well, I know Stephanie. I've known her for many years. I'm aware of modern.
You guys all hang out together at some economist parties, right?
Well, no, the sad truth is that the profession is so backward, the economics profession, that those of us that refuse to be apologists and justifiers of the status quo, we aren't that many, so we know each other. And
sure.
Stephanie and I crisscross that way. She's absolutely right. The right-wing argument about deficits making it necessary for us to do this or that, which happen to be what the right wing wants, that's always been phony. And people kind of know it. The minute something happens that they want the government to step in with big money, they're not worried about the deficit. When the economy crashed in the autumn of 2008, all those conservatives were in there having the government and the Federal Reserve pump money in. And now with the COVID crisis, same thing. It's only when the Democratic proposals to spend money on social benefits for the mass of people, suddenly we're supposed to worry. And she wants to blow that up, and she's done a good job with her colleagues in the modern monetary theory, showing that that's not a valid way to understand how the system works. So she's right. We're not held back. The government can do these kinds of things. But that's not to say that a deficit doesn't matter. Remember, a deficit, when the government borrows money, which in the modern monetary theory the government will do, that's a debt. That's an obligation the government has. It has to then pay that bondholder interest while the bondholder holds the bond, and then pay the money back when the bond matures, when it's over. It's a 5-year bond or a 10-year bond. That's a real piece of obligation. That has effects. It becomes part of the wealth that people hold. If you're rich in the United States, you own part of the national debt, and you count on that income. If you were suddenly to lose that income, you would have all kinds of economic consequences. So you have to take it into account, not in the way the right wing does, but in terms of how government debt factors in shaping everything else that goes on in the economy. That's why it's important to notice that the government is deeply in debt, that corporations are deeply in debt. Just like for families, your life is different if you know that you have a mortgage payment, a car payment, a credit card payment, and a college loan payment. You're not going to behave in the same way if you have all of those burdens than if you don't.
Professor Wolff, Dr. Kelton speaks about the fact that the United States is the issuer of the currency, and that makes a difference, and that it's the government budget is less like a household budget than the right wing would have us believe. What could you clarify what role the fact that we issue the currency plays in terms of the national debt? Yeah,
we are in control of most of the mechanisms of our monetary system. So let me give you an example. France is not. Why? Because the French are a nation using a currency they are not in control of. So if the European Union, which controls the currency known as the euro, if the European Union decides for its well-being to raise interest rates or to increase the quantity of money or any of those other things that monetary authorities that control a currency do, the French have to adjust. We don't have that problem because the United States dollar is not controlled by anybody else. So we have more degrees of freedom. We have more tools, if you like, to use to manage our economic issues, our problems, because in addition to the policy measures our government has, we control the currency that we use and that shapes our economic system. So yes, it gives us extra strength. And in the period since 1945, the dollar became not only our currency, but basically the currency for world trade. You know, goods and services sold, I'll give you an example, between Russia and China, ostensibly our adversaries. Well, most of those exchanges for most of the last 50 years have been undertaken in US dollars. That's how they work all that out, which means they're affected by what the dollar is worth in relationship to other currencies, which in turn is shaped by the United States' managing of its own currency. So the rest of the world has been adjusted to us because they used our currency. That's all changing. Indeed, this year is the first year that the majority of deals between Russia and China has not been done in dollars. First time. So
do we blame that on Donald Trump? Why is this happening?
Well, that's happening for the same reason that something is happening where the denial in the United States is really pathological. I mean, I don't know how to say this nicely. The United States is on the downside of the mountain. We had our rise after World War II from 1945 to the beginning of this century. We were king of the hill. We were the most important economy, the biggest economy, the richest economy. We had the biggest military, we had all of it. That's over. And I'm not surprised that Americans don't want to face it, but it becomes every day more dangerous. Like with any fundamental change in your life, the longer you delay coming to terms with it, the more problems it's going to create in your personal relationships, in your medical health, etc., etc. The world has changed. The United States is not in the position it was. It's not just China, although that's the most dramatic example.
But it wasn't just Trump that tipped us over the edge, right? We were climbing.
Oh, but Trump is important in a way I'll get at. The other country I would urge folks to pay attention to is Germany. Germany is the biggest economy in Europe. It shapes the Europeans in a fundamental way. Before Trump became president, there were efforts to get the Germans to do things that the United States wanted. For most of the post-war period, the Germans did it. But in the years just before Trump, they stopped doing it. They needed to find their own way. They were a successful economy, in a number of ways more successful than the United States, and they were champing at the bit of being held back. But what really changed was Trump, because in Trump, the Germans saw that the United States was reacting to the decline of its position, not by reworking its relationships, but by giving the rest of the world the middle finger, by becoming nationalists, by saying America first, and we don't care about our alliances, we don't care about we're going our own way, using our wealth, and you can all go wherever. For the Europeans, this, and the Chinese, by the way, but for the Europeans particularly, this was, if you like, the last straw. It was a signal to them that they can't rely on the alliance with the United States. They can't rely on working. They have to go their own way to save themselves. So, for example, the United States asked the Germans to stop building the gas pipeline from Russia that is going to bring natural gas to the Western Europeans. And the Germans said, sorry, we need it. So we're not going to do it. We're going to continue working the deal with the Russians. And Mr. Putin has a big smile. Then the United States asked the Germans not to cut deals with the Chinese. The Trump administration did it over and over again. And Angela Merkel in Germany said, Sorry, that's not the way the game is played anymore. And they've made one deal with the Chinese after another because the Germans need the Chinese economy to be workable for them. And if the United States is going to play hardball, America first, well, then you're going to get these consequences, which are going to damage conditions here in the United States.
Talk about that. What are we going to see here on, as they say, Main Street as we continue this slide downward?
Well, I think you're going to see. I'll give you examples. If this continues, the value of the U.S. dollar relative to the euro or to the Japanese or Chinese currencies is going to drop. If the value of the dollar drops, everything we import into this country becomes more expensive. We could begin to see inflationary increases that the American working class cannot afford. This is very serious. We're going to see economic growth in Europe and China outrun America, and that's going to draw investments over there that might otherwise have happened here. If the economic conditions here deteriorate and we get more social conflict as bitter people whose economic well-being is being undermined begin to take more and more extreme actions, like on January 6th at the Capitol, you're going to get more and more Europeans saying to themselves, and not just Europeans, but rich people around the world, it used to be that all rich people kept money in the United States because it was the safest place for wealthy people to hold their wealth. People are fond of noticing that if you walk up and down Fifth Avenue in Manhattan at night and you look up at the buildings, they're all dark. It seems like nobody lives in these expensive apartments. Answer: these are owned by foreigners. They own it as an investment. It's like keeping money in a safe deposit box in your bank to have an apartment in New York because it's a place that preserves wealth, that takes care of rich people. Imagine what would happen if all of the people around the world with wealth begin to look upon the United States, as they are beginning to do, as a country in denial, not facing its economic problems, becoming hysterical in imagining what their situation is, fighting amongst themselves in ways that can threaten the government itself. It's time to move your wealth away, put it in Paris, put it in some other place that's safer, even in China. By the way, this is also why the failure of the United States to be prepared for or to contain COVID compared to many other countries is having the effect that it is. This is taken as another sign of a society not coping with its own new, different situation and wanting to pretend that the solutions of the past are adequate to the present. They're not.
Professor Wolff, we are seeing many capitalist countries flirt with fascism, from the U.S. to Hungary to Israel. Is there a connection between capitalism and fascism?
Yes. When capitalism breaks down, when it can't do the job, it can't provide jobs for people, it can't provide a secure income, it can't provide a proper education, then people get upset. Then they become concerned. And they can go either way. They can go in a direction of saying, okay, capitalism isn't the system, it isn't working, and they're going to go and try socialism. That happens. Or they can say, our capitalism isn't working because we don't force people to behave properly. Then they go to their existing government and they impose the rules of capitalism much more harshly. They get rid of trade unions, so there's no opposition, if you like, from the working class. They get the government to enforce the capitalism to work better. That's what they did in Italy or in Germany or in Japan in the classical fascism that we had in the middle of the 20th century. It can go either way. The capitalists, of course, prefer fascism because it's a kind of enforcing of their dominance. If you go to socialism, you're getting rid of the capitalists, and they don't want that. So you can see that the society is going to split apart. And that's, again, what you began to see in those dramatic events on the 6th of January.
Gosh, we have so much further to discuss, but we're almost at the very end. I did want to touch on your piece here. You recently wrote about how defenders of capitalism are now going on the offensive, placing all kinds of qualifiers on the kinds of capitalism they support. Do these defenses hold any water, or are they just kind of trying to buoy up the sinking ship so that they don't lose money if we all decide we want shared prosperity?
Yeah, they are attempts to keep a sinking ship from going down so fast. You know, it's the attempt to say, well, okay, the kind of capitalism we have isn't really working. But if only we did, and then they want to make a little adjustment, if only we did this, well, then capitalism would work. It's a defensive reaction to a system in trouble. The one you hear most in the United States is, yes, our capitalism isn't working, but if only we had a freer market. You see, the government is too involved. The government should get out. If the government gets out, our market, that's libertarian folks like that, they want to believe in capitalism. They know the capitalism we got is no good. They do admit that, sort of, but then they come back and say, but capitalism, if only you made it this way, would give us all the benefits that make us pro-capitalist. It's a little bit desperate. We've never had free markets. It's an invention, a utopian dream that those folks have. The government has always played a major role in every capitalist economy, including the United States. I mean, a few minutes ago, Julianna, we talked about money. Money is something the government controls. If you make your own money, they arrest you and put you in jail. And nothing is more fundamental than the monetary system that keeps the economy going, and the government prints it, and the government controls it, and the government shapes it, and nobody objects to that. Nobody is proposing that we all put a printing press in our basement and make our own. So it's a little bit of a fantasy, but you're quite right. This effort to come up with something that can be done that allows us to hold on to capitalism, that's the desperate effort of people that somewhere know that this system isn't working for most people and is increasingly being questioned and challenged.
Professor Wolff, thank you so much for joining us on the program. I always appreciate it. I know we were going to talk about the minimum wage, but I know also that we're out of time. So we're going to have to do that on the next go round.
All right.
Professor Richard Wolff on Twitter is Prof Wolff, Wolff. Also find Professor Wolff's work on YouTube. He has the Economic Update and also a nice series called Ask Prof Wolff, where, you know, people send in questions and you respond to them. And that's just been wonderful. I noticed also you were live on YouTube. What is happening? This is very exciting.
I don't even know. I mean, all this stuff that I'm doing now, I can hardly keep it straight. I'm very pleased. I'm very pleased that the interest is there. The audience is there. And for me, that's the greatest news I could ask for.
We're sending everyone to your YouTube page, Democracy at Work, to follow your work. And we do thank you for coming on.
My pleasure. And thank you, Julianna, for inviting me.